The first D&D session I ever ran wasn't based on a module. The sensible place to start would have been to seek out a pre-written one-off adventure to play. The sort of game put together by far more experienced designers specifically to help newcomers like me. I chose to build something new, not as a slight against those designers, but precisely because I was a beginner. To put it plainly, I was caught up in the fantasy of creating my own game without the need for complex code or physical construction. For my first session, I built an escape room for a Dungeons & Dragons game based on The Legend of Zelda. You see, after several years of designing real-world escape rooms, I wanted to try my hand at designing puzzles for a slightly different type of game. This sort of crossover then seemed a perfect fit. I'm happy to say it was a hit with my players, our little home game still going some 60+ sessions later. However, that first session, as well as the dungeons I've built since then, wouldn't have been half, even a quarter as successful if not for the time I'd already spent studying and adapting concepts from other mediums for use in my escape rooms. These three mediums, escape rooms, video games, and tabletop role-playing games, aren't simple analogs for one another. A video game is more than a tabletop adventure with the burden of math left to a computer. An escape room's not just a video game that someone chose to build in a physical space rather than a digital one. To successfully blend ideas from multiple mediums into one game, a designer needs to be aware of both the advantages and the limitations of the medium they choose to build their game in. You've got to design challenges for the game you're actually making. By looking back at my first session, I hope to demonstrate one way that might be done. To make sense of my mashup, I think it's critical to understand the role of a game's medium and the way it affects its design and its gameplay. I want to highlight some of the ways these three mediums are linked and explain those differences I've found most relevant in my own work. I'll share some examples for each, then delve into the contents of the adventure that launched my home game, Engines of Change, to show you how I threaded it all together. This is Dungeon Diaries. No gaming medium is an island. That is, unless you're viewing it as part of a beautiful, interconnected archipelago. It should be a secret to no one, for instance, that early video games drew heavily from games like D&D and Empire of the Petal Throne. It's in pen and paper RPGs that we find the origins of fundamental concepts like character classes, side quests, critical hits, experience points. The list goes on and on and on. Video games, in turn, inspired real-world escape rooms. I can only imagine how many escape room designers saw a game like Myst and said, I want to do that. The relationship between video games and escape rooms is particularly interesting because, as fellow escape room enthusiast Mari Nolan once noted, this sort of inspiration usually runs the other way around. So many video games are digitized versions of real-world activities, but escape rooms stand as an example of, quote, digital experiences that became so popular, they spawned a new real-life genre. Inspiration and influence clearly aren't one-way streets. The rise of the escape room industry is reflected in the growing number of escape room-type video games released in the past decade. Likewise, video games have shaped the way many players approach TTRPGs. Fans have written entire compendiums featuring creatures from games like Dark Souls, Fallout, and, of course, The Legend of Zelda, that they've reworked for use in tabletop systems like D&D. And that's not even mentioning officially licensed adaptations or tabletop games directly inspired by popular video games. Video games, being by far the most lucrative of these three mediums, have become the lens through which a majority of players are likely to view the other two, myself included. An industry capable of generating more than $100 billion annually is bound to exert a certain pull on people's imaginations. But an escape room is not a video game. A tabletop adventure is not a video game. And a puzzle designer who chooses to model their work too closely on a medium outside the one they've chosen to work within will eventually have to face the fact that what's fun in one game isn't automatically fun in another. Through my own projects, I've identified 3 key points of comparison that I think highlight how a game's medium, its basic conventions, shape the experience. Those would be flexibility, player agency, and communication. These aren't the only points that should matter to a designer, and none of what I'm about to say should be treated as hard and fast rules. They're just what I've found most relevant when crafting my own puzzles and other challenges. The first point is a game's capacity to adapt and accommodate players' ideas during gameplay. To what degree can a game's rules be considered flexible? Game masters like me, whose gaming backgrounds consist mostly of video games, may be surprised to realize just how much a controller can be used to guide a player's actions. Imagine a game drops you into an alchemist's workshop. The bench before you is covered in arcane diagrams and strange instruments. Your attention, however, falls on a set of glass jars on a nearby shelf. What's inside them doesn't matter, because I, as the designer, know that they're purely decorative, but you, as the player, have no reason to assume that. If this were a video game, you might approach the shelf and find that no button prompt appears. No worries. You start pressing buttons anyway just to see if you can interact with any of the jars. Still no response. Chances are that's all you'd need to conclude the jars aren't important, and you carry on your investigation elsewhere. Now, imagine this scenario in an escape room. The jars aren't digital representations anymore, but physical objects, likely found on the clearance shelf at the nearest art supply store. The actions of a real person aren't limited by the number of buttons on a controller, so there's nothing physically stopping a player from picking up one of the jars, opening it, and making a mess of its contents. It's not a course of action most players will follow, but I think people would be surprised to see how many folks are of a mind to think the best way to investigate a handful of fake twigs in a clear container is to dump them all out on a table. And a little bit on the floor. And behind the cabinets, how did they even... Never mind. Escape rooms like the one I worked at operated under time limits. There was a schedule to keep up with. So that sort of distraction could be costly. Not only would it waste the player's time, it adds another task for a game host to tend to when resetting the game for the next group. Are there ways an escape room designer can minimize situations like that? Yes, but each comes with its own downsides. You could glue the lids shut, but some players will misinterpret that extra attention as a sign of the jar's importance. You could plaster them with stickers, marking them as props, but they can become distractions in themselves. You could remove any non-essential elements, but you'll be left with a pretty dull space, and trust me, players will still find false leads. By comparison, some video games can make you feel like you can do just about anything. Build a plane? Sure. Recreate the 1984 Transformer intro? Why not? Pet a dog? Well, you can feed them. The limits a video game imposes on players are fairly rigid, but limiting players' options isn't necessarily a bad thing. You just gotta know where to draw the line. The second point of comparison is the level of agency a game grants players. To what extent are players free to act and make meaningful choices? Game flexibility and player agency are naturally intertwined, but I think it helps to consider them separately, at least in this case. In my experience, game flexibility has more to do with the medium of choice, while player agency hinges more on a mutual understanding between the designers and players, or the dungeon master and the players. For example, in Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, there's a guard stationed at the northern gate leading out of Kakariko village. Beyond the gate lies the way to the game's second dungeon. You can visit Kakariko as soon as you reach Hyrule Field, the game's central crossroads, but before that, the game will have made clear your next objective should be reaching Hyrule Castle and meeting the princess, whatever her name is. Oh, right, Princess Ocarina. If you go and meet the princess first, you'll get a bit of lore, a new mission, and a signed letter to help you on the way. If you wander off the critical path and visit Kakariko first, the guard will just shout at you and suggest you can't read. The guard is effectively the lock keeping the gate closed, and the princess's letter is the key. The only key. In fact, it's the letter's only purpose in the game as far as I know. making it hardly different from any of the single-use keys found in the game's dungeons. Video games are full of setups like this. They're so common, actually, that people accustomed to playing video games may not fully recognize how restrictive this sort of bottleneck can be. Those restrictions are made evident when copy-pasted into a game that naturally offers players greater agency. If the Kakariko Guard were run as a D&D encounter, not only would the Guard suddenly be contending with multiple quest-minded orphans, they'd also be opposing characters with skill sets vastly more complex than what young Link has at hand. Without even considering abilities beyond those of first-level characters, a D&D party could respond to this particular obstacle in one or more of the following ways. They could try and negotiate with the Guard, offer a bribe, maybe cast a bit of magic to make them more accommodating. They could try and run some sort of distraction ploy to draw the Guard away from the gate. They could try climbing over the gate. They could try forging a letter from the princess or some local authority figure. They could try hiking around the mountain to find another path. They could cut to the chase and threaten the Guard. They could follow through on their threat. To put it mildly, there's a lot more ways this could play out in a tabletop game when compared with the original scenario. Now, a dungeon master or game master would be well within their rights to try and discourage certain behavior. They can set higher thresholds for dice rolls, they could allude to the potential consequences, they could be forthright and tell the players when something's a bad idea. Past a certain point, though, the issue becomes an interpersonal one, rather than one dictated by the game. When players and game masters disagree on how player characters should be able to respond to a situation, it's usually only a matter of time until the term railroading comes up. Matt Colville has a good video on the subject, even getting into the difference between player choice and player agency. But for the sake of this example, it should be enough to say that a DM who chooses to include an obstacle like the Kakariko Guard in the same narrow fashion would be unfairly limiting their player's agency. That sort of DM would be better off reconsidering their medium of choice, or at least evaluating the way they communicate with their players. The last point of comparison I want to touch on has to do with the channels by which a designer or game master can convey information to their players. What means of communication does a game most rely on? The methods that games use to share information could be an essay in itself, so I'll limit myself to some quick comparisons. Depending on hardware limitations, a video game could communicate via on-screen text, sound effects, music, be they individual sound cues or adaptive soundtracks, voiceover, button prompts, cutscenes, or even controller vibration. Not only do video games have the most options, they can employ some or even all of them simultaneously and automatically. Escape rooms, on the other hand, tend to rely on text clues, visible locks, pattern recognition, the occasional digital display, or obvious event triggers, such as a door popping open or the bottom of a shelf dropping out to reveal a secret compartment. A good deal of information also comes in the form of the pre-game rules presentation and the story primer. Most rooms will also feature some means of communicating with a live game host, like a set of radios or an intercom system. That way players can ask for and receive hints, but actually delivering hints is a whole other matter. Tabletop role-playing games can theoretically incorporate any of the methods I've described so far. But because the medium has such a strong improvisational component, games like D&D depend on narration and verbal description above all else. In fact, there's a whole style of play known as theater of the mind, which ditches miniatures and detailed battle maps entirely in favor of an experience where all the vivid imagery is conjured through words and sound alone. I don't personally tend to play a lot of theater of the mind, especially when it comes to my dungeons. While I can appreciate a good audio drama, even an improvised one, the game I run is based on a video game series, and that inspiration's present in more than just its characters and place names. The sun has long since set behind the jagged teeth of the Elden Mountains. The bustling city of Tarrey is awash in the light of thousands of arcane lamps, as if its spell workers and mechanists had plucked stars from the night sky itself and pinned one on every street corner. The city thrums with activity. Its colorful thoroughfares and storefronts draped with streamers and pennants and shades of rich blue to celebrate the birth of a new Hylian prince. The royal seat may be a few days' journey away, but that won't stop Hyrule's scientific capital from putting on a show. Overlooking the festivities is Tarreyton's great iron sky wheel, from which 3 as-yet untested heroes can be found disembarking. Engines of Change is my collaborative, unofficial sequel to Breath of the Wild. When this game began, we were still 2 years from learning the name of Nintendo's official follow-up. In fact, we all still thought it was coming out in 2022. One thing that hasn't changed in the intervening years is the fact that taverns in the D&D sense aren't a common sight in Zelda. So I chose to start our game with a different fantasy standby: a festival. This celebration served a few rules. Naturally, it set the stage for a spirited opener with a wide array of people to meet, sights to see, and things to do. It was also a perfect venue for an experimental escape room, in addition to some general mechanical experimentation. Though a fair bit larger than most video game starting towns, I set up Tarreyton to serve as a tutorial village of sorts. To keep the comparisons on theme, think Kokiri Forest from Ocarina of Time, or Outset Island from The Wind Waker. Remember, this was my first time running a tabletop adventure, so while my players were getting used to their characters and their abilities, I was getting to grips with live narration and other dungeon master tasks like running encounters and playing everyone and everything else. So, to give myself a framework to build off of, I drew up a list of basic concepts I wanted to be sure I featured. D&D fundamentals like roleplay, interacting with NPCs, and skill checks, along with some specifically carried over from my escape room work, like teamwork, problem solving, and lateral thinking. Oh, and combat was on the list too. Funnily enough, none of the escape rooms I'd worked on featured combat as an intended component, so it wasn't the first thing on my mind. I found places where it fit, but puzzles were a higher priority. Accompanying our heroes is an elderly Hylian man, a supervisor from the local research institute who's been showing the newcomers around town. Of all the attractions being hosted as part of the festival, he draws attention to a challenge being hosted by a former star of the institute, a cunning mechanist named Maisel.
A puzzle dungeon, she's calling it. And there's supposed to be a prize for whoever completes it the fastest. Sounds perfect for a clever bunch like you 3. Oh, I'd love to see what she's cooked up, but I shouldn't keep my granddaughter waiting much longer. I'll see you all tomorrow.
And with that, I turned my players loose to enjoy the festival. A common concern I see come up in discussions about TTRPG puzzles is that players might not be interested in engaging with them. Puzzles take a lot of prep work after all, and it can sting to see hours of work skipped over or bypassed. My solution was pretty simple. I invited players who expressed an interest in a game with puzzles. I'd already played escape rooms with 2 of my 3 players, and all 3 are smart enough to have recognized that their escape room designer turned dungeon master was offering them an escape room to play in their D&D game. Doesn't take too much to work out that that's where a lot of the work probably went. That doesn't mean I made it easy for them. Of course not. Before parting ways, the old supervisor gave the party a small poster advertising Madame Maisel's Puzzle Dungeon Challenge. What he failed to point out though, or maybe failed to notice, was that it didn't actually list where the challenge was being held. Who said puzzles had to stay confined at the dungeon? Sometimes, just getting there is a good time in its own right. Now, one of the reasons I think puzzles are a scarce element in most D&D games is because they don't tend to show up in a lot of popular actual play shows. Good puzzles take a bit of thought to solve, and for many people, that's a pretty quiet activity. Not the sort of thing that makes for good YouTube Shorts content. Puzzle games also aren't as fun to watch played as other sorts of games, so I've devised a little system for breaking down my puzzles so I'm not just recounting them chronologically. I like to think of my puzzles as consisting of a lock and its corresponding keys. A lock could be an actual lock, or some other sort of obstacle. In the instance I just described with the poster, the lock would be the fact that the poster doesn't list a location for the challenge. That missing information is preventing the players from participating in said challenge. The keys then can be broken down into little keys and a large key. The large key is the object or piece of information that opens the quote-unquote lock. The little keys are clues, little bits of information I think are important to discover in the search for the large key. Some little keys depend on others being found first, but not always. Sometimes they might not even be necessary. What's important is that there's enough keys or information for players to reasonably draw the intended conclusion, and also that there's multiple valid ways to obtain said keys. If a puzzle hinges on your players talking to one specific character to get one specific piece of information, that's just the Kakariko guard again. For this poster puzzle, the large key involves the party arranging 3 colored variants of the poster in a manner resembling the Triforce to reveal a rough map that will lead them where they need to go. The little keys then could be broken down something like this. Would-be challengers have been seen comparing, manipulating, even modifying copies of the posters. There are multiple versions of the poster: red, green, and blue. The colors of the posters match those associated with the goddesses from Hyrule's creation story. Each of those goddesses is commonly associated with an individual piece of the relic known as the Triforce, and traditionally, the piece on top corresponds with the color red, the left with blue, and the right with green. But where and how to lay these breadcrumbs? Firstly, at an event of this scale, it would make sense to have information booths, so the party went to inquire at one. I also wanted to see how they deal with a less friendly NPC, so I had the attendant be a bit more of an obstruction, like they wanted the prize and were trying to dissuade folks from entering in order to limit the competition. I ended up having a curious restaurant owner give the party the tip about people comparing posters, but I think a better way to handle that would have been to have the booth attendant fiddling with a couple of posters and then try to hide them when the party approached. Give the players a bit of suspicious behavior to look into and roll some checks. Skill checks were how I went about revealing some of the keys lower on the list. Not the fact that there were red, green, and blue posters though. Rolling to identify 3 colored posters sounds like a pretty cheap excuse for a dice roll. It just so happens that each of the player characters' respective knowledge of their world correlated with their player's own relative knowledge of The Legend of Zelda. That was not planned, but my brother, whose knowledge of the series was second only to mine in the group, did go to school to teach history, and he chose to play a monk with a passion for history. Had he pieced together the Triforce connection on his own, I wouldn't have stopped him from applying that knowledge. 3 colored posters, even in a Zelda-inspired game though, still isn't a lot to go on, so I still got to have them roll for the next key. D&D characters have a list of 18 basic skills, with options to be proficient in a handful of them depending on the type of character. There are 2 skills in that list, however, that see more use than perhaps any others, and they are perception and investigation. In a game with a greater emphasis on puzzles, I could easily see us coming to rely quite heavily on those 2, almost becoming general look and find actions and then ultimately just roll to solve the puzzle. Depending on the situation, some skills simply aren't going to be relevant. However, I didn't want my players to feel like they'd made a bad choice for not choosing proficiency in one or both of those skills, so I made sure some less common ones got used up front. Instead of calling for perception or investigation checks, I asked for religion or history checks. I would have accepted the other 2 if a player asked to roll one of them instead, but I wanted to encourage them to make use of more unique proficiencies. Think of it as a bit of characterization, taking a general question like, "What am I missing here?" and reframing it to instead ask, "Is there a cultural reference here that could point me in the right direction?" As our heroes arrange the posters, they start to notice subtle patterns in each of them that help them with the alignment. they start to see that it forms a rough map of a section of town they walked through earlier that day, with a circle around what looks like a specific building. If this were a video game, players might be expected to compare this hidden map against the game's map screen, then navigate the rest of the way themselves. In an escape room, players might do something similar and compare the physical posters with a large map framed on the wall. Maybe the coordinates of that specific building are the clue to opening a lock somewhere in the room. In either case, you could say that the large key as I described it for this tabletop version was just another little key on the way to a large key further down the line. Being that this was a puzzle presented in a TTRPG though, I could get by simply describing them finding the map, reaching the sign-up location, and securing themselves a time slot. Could I have made some sort of prop for my players to work with? Probably. It would have had to have been digital, since we primarily play via video calls, but either way, it would have been a lot of extra work for very little reward. Instead, I spent time developing festival games for them to play while, quote, waiting for their time slot. And yes, I did borrow that real-world convention so that I could save the challenge proper for the climax of the session. It's a minor adaptation, but one I'm quite proud of. I won't linger too long on these festival games since they're not puzzles, but I think they're still worth a moment's elaboration for two reasons. First, they allowed my players a chance to explore a bit and develop their characters further. Second, they gave me an opportunity to test the graphics I've made to display via screen share. I had a simple strength tester minigame, a platform-based minigame that served as a simplified combat tutorial, and I even ran a minor street fight encounter. But the one I want to highlight required no rolls whatsoever. Using Photoshop to handle the pixel art, I treated my players to a retro take on the Squid Bingo game from The Wind Waker. By screen sharing a portion of my monitor, they got to focus on the game without seeing the ins and outs of me toggling layer visibilities. They couldn't interact with it directly, I instead had them take turns picking tiles to target, but by keeping things simple, this indirect form of gameplay proved fun as well as functional. That's another thing I've learned about puzzles in this game. Sometimes it's fine to have something that doesn't require dice rolls. Sometimes it's just a nice change of pace to let the players struggle or succeed based on their own abilities, probability aside. To entice my players further to engage with these games, each of them rewarded them with different items capable of granting little boosts that could prove useful in Maisel's challenge, the time for which soon arrived. The assistant leads our heroes into a side room and directs them toward a set of benches. A lever's pulled, the lights dim, and a pair of curtains open to reveal a painted cutout of a sharply dressed Hylian woman wearing a pair of stylish welding goggles.
Welcome, challengers, to an endeavor like no other. You are about to embark on a quest inspired by this kingdom's legendary and labyrinthine history. In the chambers beyond wait 3 trials constructed by yours truly that you will attempt to complete within 1 hour. No part of the trials are meant to be destroyed or otherwise damaged. Weapons will not be confiscated, but be warned that undue damage to my creations will result in your immediate disqualification and forfeiture of any shot at the grand prize. Hints are available by pressing a hand against one of these specially marked wall tiles, but know that each hint will add 3 minutes to your final time, so you better make them count. If you have any further questions, ask my assistant, because this is a pre-recorded message, and I can neither see nor hear you. Or can I? Good luck.
When her speech concludes, another set of curtains open to reveal a rolling door leading into the mysterious and much anticipated puzzle dungeon. Yes, I did do a pre-game rules briefing and everything. No brute force, how to ask for hints. The whole presentation was remarkably similar to the ones I used to give every weekend. There was one major element that differed from a real-world escape room though, even though it got mentioned in the speech. I didn't actually bother tracking a time limit. When I was describing the differences between mediums earlier, The pace of gameplay could have easily been, and nearly was, its own item on the list. I've already noted that TTRPGs rely on narration. Now, combine that with the time spent rolling dice and doing the associated math, and what you get is individual rounds, which are commonly treated as occurring over the span of 6 seconds, in fact playing out over the course of a few minutes or more. The time dilation at play will make your head spin if you think about it too long. So I didn't. I wanted to focus on the puzzles anyway. I did have my players roll to determine a turn order, just to make sure everyone got a fair shake at pitching solutions. Chamber number 1. A large square room with a large door on the eastern wall. Crates and jars in opposite corners, and panels sticking out in the center of the floor and on a wall near the door. The lock for this room is pretty obvious, a literal locked door. To open the door, players needed to find 4 activation panels and press them all at the same time. A simple setup, but one that combines my love of puzzles that see players coordinating actions in different locations with a puzzle motif seen in a lot of Zelda games. By having more panels than player characters, my players had to work out a way to press their respective panels while also handling the 4th. But I've only mentioned 2 panels so far. Let's take a look at those little keys. Pushing either of the first 2 panels triggers the sound of a bolt sliding out of place in the vicinity of the door. Releasing the panel results in the sound of the bolt sliding back into place. Clearly something's happening, but there's more to it. The door design features 4 lines with key symbols converging on a lock icon in the center of the door. I generally don't ask for skill checks to see something featured in a screen-shared map or graphic, but I will call attention to it if a player asks to make a relevant roll. 4 lines on the door, but only 2 visible activation panels. There must be 2 more somewhere. There's a panel hidden behind the jars in one corner, no rolls required to move them aside. And there's a panel on the ceiling near the corner with the crates. My way of establishing that looking up is still worth doing, even if I can't easily display it on the map. This particular panel would require a roll or 2. My players picked up on the placement of the crates and rolled athletics to stack them safely and form a staircase. If they rolled low though, whoever climbed up might have to make a dexterity save in order to keep their balance. I would have accepted other solutions too. All that mattered to me was that they figured out a way to press it in time with the other 3. Chamber number 2. A larger, round room with a pedestal in the middle, framed by 4 columns. 4 shorter pillars stand at the perimeter of the chamber. The lock? Another locked door. The key to opening it? Collecting the 6 keys around the edge of the chamber, and popping each of them into the slots in the pedestal. There's not much to say here in terms of little keys, apart from the fact that the shorter pillars I described were actually BMOS-type enemies designed to shoot little stunning blasts at the party and slow their progress. I'd meant it as a tutorial for saving throws, but if I were to redo it now, I'd add some more obstacles and use it as an opportunity to teach players about the dash and dodge actions, letting them decide whether it was better to try and sprint to grab the keys, or play it cautious and focus more on avoiding Maisel's peril eyes. On to the last chamber. I realize it sounds fast, but it still ended up being close to an actual escape room in terms of real-world time, and just as exciting. Chamber number 3. A square chamber like the first, but lined with racks of weapons and shelves full of various treasures and trinkets. At the center stands a large armored construct, a shield on one arm and the other extended as if to receive something. The lock? Yeah, it's another locked door. My intent was not subtlety. The key to opening it and completing the challenge? Finding the correct item and presenting it to the construct. As for the little keys, an inscription on the construct shield reads, "Present to me that which all true warriors strive for." My brother already knew what I was getting at, but since they weren't just speaking a password, that knowledge only got him so far. The construct is not seeking a weapon. If given one, it'll move as if examining it, then return it. The same thing goes for random artifacts.
Peace is what all true warriors strive for.
Easily recalled with an average history roll. maybe insight if a player character's more wisdom-oriented. Hyrule has an ancient tradition associating olive trees with peace and wisdom, much like the real-world notion of extending an olive branch, discernible by means of a religion, history, or nature check. This association's one that I chose to add to the lore. I didn't want my other players to feel like they were at a disadvantage for not being Legend of Zelda scholars, so I wove in a bit of symbolism they'd recognize, though slightly obscured by not having the key be an actual branch. Instead, there's a gold wire model of an olive tree on one of the shelves. Unseen gears click and whir beneath the construct's armor as it brings its shield forward to hide the tree. A moment later, it withdraws the shield and holds out its hand, where a key now sits. And so the challenge and the session as a whole concluded with a nod to my favorite Indiana Jones movie. Or at least that's where the players likely expected things to wrap up. Instead, the shield starts to slide back but halts, and the construct shudders, and a screech of grinding metal fills the chamber. The sound swells until it peaks with a rasping crunch. Rivulets of dust and grit fall from the crack that's opened in the ceiling, the only sound in a moment of sudden quiet. Then there's something, several somethings, moving about on the other side of the ceiling. I couldn't rightly end the inaugural session of a Zelda-based adventure without a boss fight, right? And by capping things off with a Dodongo battle, my players got to wrap up their first outing with a dungeon and a dragon. Roll credits. A few final notes. I'm still remarkably proud of the work that went into this first session. My players and I all had a blast playing through it, and it left us all eager to play more. There's definitely room for improvement, though. As good of a job as I think I did merging elements of all three mediums, it took a few more dungeons to realize that I was neglecting the Zelda trope of the dungeon item. It still took me a while to start working with the idea proper, so in the meantime, I'd recommend the piece by Master the Dungeon about building Zelda-inspired dungeons. I'll link to it in the description along with the other pieces I've referenced. I have ideas of how I would implement a dungeon item into this challenge, but I might save that for a longer write-up than I'm planning. Another area that's taken a while for me to improve upon has to do with rationalizing dungeons, a habit that started here. By leaning into a more industrialized, steampunk aesthetic for my take on Hyrule, I think I set myself up to focus a bit too much on making these dungeons into grounded, realistic spaces. Too much time justifying the absence of these places in Breath of the Wild. I've had to remind myself to just enjoy the fantasy of it, because if I don't, I'll end up spending months meticulously designing another space, as if I had actual building codes to adhere to. But that's a story for another time. Next time, though, another dungeon, another dragon, and two Zelda fans on eerily similar wavelengths. See you next time.